Hello and welcome to Racecraft again. As you can see, I've started on my V8 Sigma conversion, but this other job came in which is fairly interesting. This little diff here is out of a Sunbeam Alpine, and for some reason the POMs like their hubs on a taper with a keyway in it. The axle itself is splined into the diff, but at the wheel end they like this setup where there's a taper and a single keyway. The problem with it is, of course, is that all the power has been taken by that one little keyway. So they shear the keyway off, choose up the end of the axle, choose up the spline, the taper inside here, and it all gets pretty ugly. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a BTR 78 diff in it out of like an EBED right through to AU Falcon. This is 3:45 ratio, limited slip, 28 spline. Now, in order to get all the brackets and everything off that diff and onto here, I've made up this little jig here. These brackets here are for the shock absorbers. This diff is actually upside down right now. But I've got to be able to put those back on to the new diff in exactly the same position. So I made this crude looking thing here. It's got a couple of holes in it here which locate into the spring perches and slip onto these pins that the shock absorbers mount on. So, can't get that on there right now, but anyway, once I've got that on, I can cut those brackets off, offer that up to the new diff, and they'll go back on in exactly the same position. The other thing I've got to do is I've got to mount the original brakes, these drum brakes, onto the new diff, and that way all the braking system stays absolutely stock standard. I don't think it's going to be too big a job. That's the end cut off that diff. I've already started cutting the diff, and you can see there's a little lip on there, so I've got to bore that centre out to suit the end of that diff. Once I've got that on there, I can turn it around and get it orientated into the correct position. So that's those bits and pieces. I've already pulled the axles out and I've taken the bearings off. I had to get these tone wheels off the end of the axle because we won't be using those. Also had to take those out so I could get the studs out. So that's been done. The axles, I've already cut the axles to length. I haven't splined them yet, but I've cut the axles to length, and I've also welded up all the old stud holes. So I've left the access hole there so we can get a socket in to put the bolts back in. So this will go in the lathe next, machine it up, drill the stud pattern for the Sunbeam Alpine into this, put the original studs back in, and then line up the drum with the backing plate to make sure everything's in the right spot.
I have to adapt these original Sunbeam Alpine brakes onto our new BTR diff. That's the axle end of the BTR diff. So what I've done today is I've bored out this diameter here so that our BTR axle, our housing, just goes straight in. So that's now located the drums onto the end of the axle housing. The only thing I've got to do now is orient these in the correct position so all the lines and handbrake and everything lines up. The other thing I've got to do is I've got to get the flange of the diff in the correct position relative to the shoes, so we're not half off the shoes or hitting the edge of the backing plate. So I'm going to have to put a bearing onto the axle, do a dummy assembly, put it all together, see where the shoes end up in relation to the drum, and then space the axle whichever way it's got to go. So that's the next little job. So next thing I've got to do on these axles is drill the Sunbeam Alpine stud pattern into them. Now when you go to drill the axles, you've got to be able to hold the axle somehow nice and straight and then drill the holes. You can't do it by hand because your studs are going to end up all crooked, and you're not even guaranteed of getting the hole on the size that you want because the studs press fit in here, so it's got to be a pretty precise hole. So a few years ago I came up with a way of holding the axle in the drill press. So take the table off, and I'm left with this round diameter in here. So what I've done, so I've made up a whole bunch of these collars for different size axles, which is a nice neat fit into the drill press, and also a nice neat fit onto the axle. So pop that in there, give it a tighten up, and you've got it nice and square to the end of the drill press. In order to make the Alpine drums fit our BTR axles, I've had to turn this register that's on the BTR axle. I've had to turn it down, make it narrower, but I've also had to increase the diameter. So I had to make up a ring and press fit it onto the end of the axle there. So now when you put the drum on, it just it just locates neatly onto that register and keeps the drum centered over the shoes. I've got to cut these shock absorber brackets off the diff. Now, with the permission of the owner, I've actually cut the axle tube off the original diff housing. I was going to cut these off with a little 1mm disc, but I kind of hate grinding anyway. But because this is a Z shape, it's really difficult to get down inside there. So I was afraid I was going to end up cutting too much of the bracket off. So I come up with another way, and that is to simply put it in the lathe and then bore the axle tube away and just leave the bracket on its own. So I'll get all this set up, start cutting up, show you how it goes. Okay, so I've bored the axle tube away to virtually nothing, and that's what I'm left with, just the little bracket on its own. And it's even machined a nice radius in there, so when we pop that onto the new diff, that should fit the radius of the housing pretty nice. I've already got my jig built to locate this in the right position, so that certainly saved a whole lot of grinding. I have the diff all set here now. It's cut to length. I've just got to weld the axle tubes back on again. Then I'll weld the spring pads on. I'll use my jig to get them in the correct position, and then I can put the shock mounts on. They've turned out quite well. They've got a nice radius in them, so they should sit really nicely back on the diff, and the diff jig will put them in the correct angle for us. So I'll get this welded up, put the diff jig on, get on to the next part. One of the things I had to do on this new diff was swap out the aluminium back hat. It's got the pin on it there for the Watts linkage, for a steel hat, because I had to weld a little bracket onto the back here for the handbrake mechanism. There's a rod comes across the back here and goes through a little bronze bush in this little bracket, so it was easy enough to weld straight onto the back of the tin hat. So that's another little job out of the way. I've got it set up now. I've drilled the backing plates, so the brakes are ready to go on. The only thing I've got to do now is weld on these shock absorber mounts. So I've got them in position. I've got them nice and square. They're bolted on through these little bolts through there. So I'll tack them on now, and then fully weld them, and we'll be able to assemble the rest of the diff. Maybe make up a brake line for it as well, and it'll be ready to go. The diff's finished. So this is our new Sunbeam Alpine Borg-Warner 78. So this is 28 spline, limited slip, got the original brakes on it. We made up another brake line across the back here, put all the little brackets on for the handbrake. The original shock absorber mounts are on there, put brand new saddles on it. That's it. It's finished. It's all set to go. This would actually be a really good conversion for like a Sunbeam Tiger with the V8 and the 260 or 289, because these are very, very strong diffs. They're a bit stronger again than a Borg-Warner, although people tend to call these Borg-Warner diffs, but they're not. Borg-Warner was a 75. This is a BTR 78, so it's actually got a bigger crown wheel and pinion in it. So that's it. She's all done. Thanks for tuning in.